Good morning, Dr. Low. It's a pleasure for us to interview you today. And so let me start a question. Uh, when and how did you start to become more involved in environmentalism and care about environmental issues? And are there any particular environmental issues that first sparked your interest in the environment?
Well, it was a long time ago. It was in the 1980s, and I was a younger person then. There was a time in the 1980s where I used to travel a lot for work. And, when you're traveling, you want to read something. In those days, there was no movies to watch on airplanes. So it was always important to bring something to read. So I would read books, and I would read a lot of the current affairs magazines at the time. And there was a period of time around the middle of the 1980s where quite a number of the magazines that I happened to be reading were writing long articles about the environment. And I remember very well long articles on deforestation, on ozone depletion, and on global warming. And I thought at the time that even if half of those articles turned out to be right, we were in big trouble. But I didn't know anything about the environment. This was just what I was reading. And one day, in I think around 1985, I was walking down a street in Central, and I ran into an acquaintance, and her name was Linda Siddle. And I said to her, "Oh, Linda, I read in the newspaper that you've just created an environmental organization called Friends of the Earth in Hong Kong." So she said, "Oh, I have." And she says, "Oh, Christine, are you interested in the environment?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if I am, but I've been reading these magazines, and they talked about all these big problems." So anyway, so we had a conversation, and before long, Linda, who is the founder of Friends of the Earth in Hong Kong, she got me to join Friends of the Earth. And before I knew it, she made me chairman of Friends of the Earth. So this was in the second half of the 1980s. So from then, I started to learn. I started to understand more, I read more, talk to people who knew about the environment. That was how I got started. So when you understand an issue more, you become more informed, and I became the spokesperson, because I was the chairman of a number of issues, and that's how I learned. And so you could say I have no formal training in the environment as such. Neither did Linda. She was a lawyer by training. So I think in the 1980s, many of us learned about the environment because we became interested. So it's a little unlike you, because you already started to learn about the environment when you're at school.
So I guess when we ask about our older audiences, the first thing they will think of Dr. Low Yu is working in the government. So having worked in the government for quite a long time, do you think the government actually imposes a strong stance of environmental protection on themselves? It's sure that the government has some environmental policies on the citizens, but do they actually implement these sort of protection policies on themselves also? Like when they're working in the legislative council or other buildings, is working there actually achieving a carbon neutrality, or it's actually also harming the environment?
Well, if I can put it another way, I think you are jumping directly to asking a question without first maybe asking yourself, what is the role of government? Right now, and then you can apply this line of thinking, not just to the Hong Kong government, but to all governments. Right now, because the role of government is obviously to make policies that applies to society. Mm. So governments are dealing with public affairs. And of course, the environment is one of these important public affairs. So the first thing I want to say is governments have traveled a long way, not just the Hong Kong government, but many other governments have traveled a long way over the course of the past few decades on the environment. The environment was not always a topic of great concern. Now, you can find this out by looking at when Hong Kong or when the UK or the US or any other government, when did those places start having environmental laws? Now, that's a good indication, right? When did they start? So in Hong Kong, one of the earliest pieces of legislation is on air quality. And you will see that this only came about really in the 1970s. If you looked at the US, the Clean Air Act, this was passed at about the same time. So what I'm saying is the 1970s was not so far away, right? And if you were to have a look at your parents, right, and say, well, when were your parents born? You will say that actually 1970s was not so far away. So you can say that from the 1970s, the government started to look at pollution control because it was very obvious that there was a lot of pollution. So we looked at air pollution, water pollution, right? Now, but when you're thinking today, right, today, when you're at school, we are not just talking about pollution control. We're talking about sustainability, right? We're talking about carbon neutrality. This is so far away from what governments were talking about in the world, not just in Hong Kong, right? In the world about the environment. That the point I'm trying to make is governments around the world started to travel more seriously on an environmental path from about the 1970s and the 1980s. Some countries, some jurisdictions went further and faster than others. Right, so today, when you're asking how serious is the Hong Kong government, then you have to look back a little at the history. And you might say, well, are there any governments that really have incorporated environmental thinking totally in their policies? I have to say the answer is no. The answer is no. So you are a younger generation that is now on a journey that people understand much more about the environment. Right. So as I said, I only really started in the 1980s, right? And I was already working. I was already around 30 years old. Right, but you are starting much, much younger. This reflects the fact that there is a long journey. So today, your questions is not just about, are we doing very well in pollution control? And even there, we can do better, right? We're now asking, well, how's the government doing on energy efficiency and water efficiency and sustainable development? And how are they doing on biodiversity and nature conservation? Well, I can tell you, we're not doing so well on everything, right? But I think that's not the point of what we're really talking about. We're talking about a journey that has actually taken several decades. And today, we're much more concerned because we now understand that climate change is a real crisis for everyone, right? For all of us. So that's why we are more, we need to accelerate. We need to accelerate our efforts. So maybe that is the perspective that you can try to look at Hong Kong policies, right? So you can say, all right, we're not yet, where we want to be, but are we accelerating? Where can we accelerate? How can we accelerate to go from where we are today to, for example, right? The world wants to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 to 2060. Right? You know all about that. Yes. Okay. Then you want to say, in my society, right? In my city, in Hong Kong, are we going to get there? Do we know how to get there? So I think that's such an important question, particularly for your generation. Right? So you can look at the Hong Kong government and you can say, right, what are some of the policies that you've got to accelerate on? And are you able to show us plans that gives us a high degree of confidence that Hong Kong will accelerate and we too will fulfill our responsibility in the world to become net zero? Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
Right? I know that's a very Cheng-Hei way of answering your question.
Regarding the rate of acceleration of Hong Kong's development of achieving sustainability and carbon neutrality. So because when you're setting up these policies, we have to consider not just the environmental aspect, but also the social and economical aspect. So we would like to ask you, how do you actually balance these three aspects to make the best out of it and not to compromise either one of these very important factors?
I think you have to ask yourself, what is out of balance? Right? What is most out of balance? And if you accept the science of climate change, then what's the most important thing we have to do? Right? We have to accelerate to keep the world, not just Hong Kong, right? To keep the world in a space where we're not going to be overwhelmed by climatic changes, right? There will already be severe climatic events, but we don't want it to be so bad that it threatens, right, the existence of humanity. That's what we're worried about. And the science have told us that we really need to accelerate towards carbon neutrality. Okay, so what does it mean for us socially? So the question is, all right, we know what we are supposed to do. What does it mean for us socially? What are we being asked to change? Obviously, many things need to change. Now, some of it you and I can control. Some of it you and I cannot control. So the major issues, for example, how do we switch away from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuels? Now, that's not something you and I can do, right? We need society to do it. We need industry to do it. And we need to do it all around the world. And we need to accelerate, right? We need to do it quite fast. So that's one realm of issues. Another realm of issues is you and I. What can you and I control? Now, it's asking some quite hard questions. So it is about how we use resources. So small things like don't waste water, don't waste food, How can we be more energy efficient? You know, what is it that you and I can do? And are we doing it? And how can we get our friends and our peers and the institutions that we belong to do it, or do it together? Right? It's not so easy. It's not so easy. Even if you are willing to do it, maybe it's hard to persuade the rest of your family or the rest of your school, right? So the social side requires everybody to actually accept that we do have to change certain things. And we need governments. We need governments to change those things that you and I cannot control. So, for example, if you want to be more energy and water efficient, you need government to tighten the laws so that we have much higher standards of energy efficiency. So we look around the world and we say, which countries have really the best energy efficiency regulations? Well, you see Germany and you see Japan. And you can calculate, right? You say, well, if everybody was as energy efficient today as Germany and Japan, how much energy can we save, right? You know, so you can think about these things, and you can say to your own government, you can say to the Hong Kong government, when are you setting new laws so that we too in Hong Kong will have better standards for energy and water? Now, then coming back to the social side, they're saying, well, you know, people are not willing to do it. Well, that's not good enough, right? We need the whole of society to say we need these things. We have done it before, right? We've got, when we go into a car, everybody wears a seatbelt today. That wasn't the case when I was your age. And many people all around the world, not just in Hong Kong, complained that they didn't want to do it. Right? But, you know, after a while, people change and everybody does it, right? So change, social changes, right? Changing our behavior is possible. Now, also, the other thing is, our water in Hong Kong is extraordinarily cheap. So it's easy to waste water. So how can we think about repricing? These are the sort of things you will learn maybe in your economic classes, you know. How do we make certain things more expensive so you and I don't waste it? And actually, there are other concepts that are even more far-reaching. Rich societies like Hong Kong, we tend to be more wasteful. But the earth only has so much natural resources. How do we share these resources with societies that are less well off? You know, so these are major global discussions. You know, that's why you know about the Paris Agreement, right? You know about these meetings called COPs. And we just had COP26. One of the discussions, it's about development. Development in developing economies. What are we going to do for them? Right. So the social side is not just about you and I sitting in Hong Kong. The social side also means on a worldwide basis. So these are difficult discussions. That's why it's so important for leaders of countries to have these discussions, and for leaders of society to be able to come back to you and I and talk to us in a way that these resources can be shared more equitably. And then the economics, right? The financial, yes, certain things are going to be more expensive. We cannot get from here to there, from the way we are to the way we're going to be, without some additional cost. And who's going to pay that cost? But what is the threat? Right? The threat is the 1.5 degrees. This is the red line, the danger line for humanity as a whole. You know, so you're going to witness everybody arguing about all these issues. And you need to decide for yourself what you think. And don't listen to other people, right? Never mind about what I think, never mind about what other people think. Those are the issues. And you need to think through for you and your generation, what is important to you. And then find the occasion to share your views with your peers and with other people.
Okay. So moving on to the next question. Now newspaper are getting less and less popular, and most people use like social media, like Instagram, to get their environmental news, and they may not check like what they see on social media and like believe it. So do you have any advice for social media users when receiving such information, and like what sources of information on the environment do you think are reputable and that you recommend?
Well, Akkinson, that's a really good question. And it isn't just about the environment, right? I mean, social media has all kinds of information on it. And all of us are on some kind of social media platform all the time. So the important thing is I try to do this too. So you asked the question, what is reputable? And I think the thing is, you need to find out for yourself what those things are. And it does take a little bit of effort. And, because social media circulates, right? All kinds of information and images very, very quickly. And we tend to trust things that comes from people we know, but it may not be correct. So I think the first thing is, whatever subject it is, we just happen to be talking about the environment. Those issues that are really important to you, you want to become more knowledgeable about it. And once you yourself have a foundation understanding, some 101 about the issue, it becomes much easier to judge whether you think something is, what you think about it. And you are on social media all the time, so it's not impossible to check. Right? It's how shall I put it? In my days, there was just one or two places that you can go and find out what we think is accurate. Today, you can go to many, many more places, but you have to make an effort. Because before, maybe we all read the same newspapers, right? And don't forget, newspapers is not and has never been actually the sources of truth or accuracy. But newspaper is just something to report to you as to what's happening. So I could be, right? I could be reporting on what Akkinson Kwong said. It's just that you said something. But it isn't about whether it's correct or whether it's good or bad, right? It's just what you said. So I think for you to be able to discern the relevance or the correctness or what you think about something, that's where your critical mindset, how you think about things, become really important. I mean, I read a lot of things, and it's also sometimes not about whether you agree or you disagree with something. The first thing is to kind of get to grips with just understanding what the issue is about. Before you how shall I put it? Before you develop your own opinion, get the facts right, and know how to ask the right questions of people. To draw them out, ask the right questions.
So furthermore, I have a question about, because in the year 2000, we all know that you founded like a think tank, which is called Civic Exchange. And just now you mentioned topics such as scarcity, the efficient use of resources, etc. Like, can you comment on the decision to set up a think tank rather than like found a social enterprise or NGO? So how do you make sure that the research results are as neutral as it could be?
Right. I think the question is not whether you're a think tank or some other kind of institution. The thing is how you approach an issue. So I think if you're going to do just research, right, you have to get the facts right. Right? Get the facts right first.
Yeah.
And then you can say, based on these facts, we make the following conclusion and recommendation. I think what's important is we can argue about our recommendation and our views, but we shouldn't argue about the facts. So what are the facts, right? Can we get the facts right? Is it 1 meter or is it 2 meters, right? Is it when did this start, or what were the laws? And, you know, so can we get the facts right? Okay, after you, so being a think tank, we had an ethos about what kind of think tank we're going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to get the facts right, first of all, and then we can discuss what do you do? Because a public policy think tank is about public policies. We're not a think tank for everything, right? We're interested in public policies to help solve problems for society. We are very explicit about that. You know, what is the purpose of civic exchange? And how do we approach our research? So these are questions that you can always ask people. So you can ask any think tank, what's your approach to doing research? Now, then when you get the facts right, you can say, well, what are our values? So, for example, we are very keen on the environment. We believe in environmental protection. Now, this is not all think tanks have the environment as a major topic. So sustainability was an attitude that we have in our thinking about solutions. And you should be explicit about that. Right? Now, Anson, you asked the question just now of how do you balance different things? So in a particular issue, what are the interests or what are the issues that you have to consider for this problem? Right? So we had a way of doing our policy research. And I think this is a think tank, it's not a social enterprise. We're in policy thinking. And we want it to be in the non-profit sector because we could set up a consultancy, a for-profit consultancy, but we didn't want to do that. Does that answer your question, Vinson?
Yeah. Right.
So going back to just now that we as a citizen also needing to contribute to carbon neutrality. So the beef consumption is heard to be a very important part of like achieving carbon neutrality. And we heard you mention that the amount of beef consumption should be at the a rate of what is called occasional. And so we would like to ask about how much do you think exactly should be the amount of beef that an individual should be consumed, and how would you actually encourage Hong Kong citizens to choose other meat options such as like chicken, pork, or even vegan meat?
Well, I think the first thing is let's look at the facts, right? You know, so the logic of me asking people to eat less meat comes from the facts of how much greenhouse gases come from different types of meat. And I think if you go online, you can see, beef has the largest greenhouse gas emissions. And then you have pork and chicken and so on, right? So it's a very large portion. So that's number one. Number two is in terms of eating. Why do we eat? Going back to real fundamentals. And I'm sure your parents are all saying to you, eat more healthily. Why are you eating all this crap all the time? Oh, sorry. Let me close the door because otherwise the dog will bark. So I think the other thing is going back to actually what kind of diet should we have? Can you and I and planet Earth, right? People on planet Earth, because the goal is we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the ways is if we eat less meat, that's actually quite effective. So how much meat are we eating? Actually, we can see, right? You can see what's the import of meat and how much meat people are eating in different cities. There are facts on that. And we know that as societies become richer, we eat more meat. Right. So I think we can say to ourselves, well, what if we ate less meat? Is that a problem? Well, actually, it's not a problem. We can eat less meat. So when I say, shall we eat less meat? Now you can say we can eat less meat at meals, or you could say we can eat just less meat in a week. And that's why you have movements like Green Monday, right? Green Monday is very successful. It's taken them 10 years. And now Green Monday, everybody says, oh yes, 1 day a week, I'm not going to eat meat. So these are the slow changing of mindsets.
So let me ask the last question of today's interview. What do you think makes youth different from any other demographic in terms of environmental protection? And what words of advice would you give to our audience, who are especially high school students who aim to work in the environment?
Well, I think let me answer the second question first. It's marvelous that there are high school students like yourself who are interested. I mean, this really is marvelous because in my time, there were relatively few people who were interested. And in Hong Kong, I was just one of the earlier people, starting in the 1980s that got interested. But today, there are people like you and many of your friends who are interested. So I think that's very good. Secondly is, your first question was, how am I different? Can you ask that again, Vinson?
What makes youth different from any other demographic?
Demographic?
In terms of age or in terms of their creativity, in terms of helping the environment?
Okay, well, in my demographic, as I said, when I was at school, no one talked about the environment. It really happened kind of much later. And the way that I learned about the environment was not really at school, right? It was really from other places. So I think today you know more at a much younger age, and that's very important. Also, we have gone a longer way in the last 20 or 30 years in understanding how important the environment is. I think now we understand that there are actually limits to planet Earth. there is a concept, I don't know whether you've heard about it, called planetary boundaries. If you haven't heard about it, go online and take a look. This is a new concept. Well, not so new now, but it's a relatively new concept that if you look at planet Earth and you look at all the natural functioning of climate Earth, these are like systems, right? You know, climate Earth has all these systems of balancing, like how does the atmosphere clean up the air, you know, or the water cycle and all of that, right? These are all things that are there that makes planet Earth function. Now, the human dimension is that we have added our behavior, right, to the function of planet Earth. And some of these systems, planetary systems, is now not in balance. So too much pollution, for example, right? That the atmosphere is warming too quickly because we're burning fossil fuels, right? Or we are overfishing, for example, right? So there are all these examples of the natural systems of planet Earth that are now out of balance. That's the idea behind planetary boundaries, and it's a science concept. So the question they ask, or the scientists ask, is: so, for example, with greenhouse gases, right? Global warming. What happens to these planetary systems when, for example, we go from where we are, right, to maybe another 0.5 degree or another 1 degree warmer? Actually, we don't know. We don't know, but we know there are risks. So as we exceed the current boundaries, and where these boundaries are, this is what scientists are trying to understand, where these boundaries are. And if we exceed these boundaries, what happens to the system, right? So what I'm saying is, I think today we are asking these questions that we didn't ask before. Our great worry is actually there isn't time. If we don't accelerate and make changes, maybe we will enter into a space beyond these boundaries without knowing what will happen. So like the idea of global warming, right? If we exceed a certain temperature, it will threaten life on Earth, including ours, right? So the risk to humanity is quite great. So I think we're able to articulate more widely, right? Because you're already learning about that at school. Whereas 30 or 40 years ago, these kinds of discussions were very small circle discussions amongst experts.